Hello and welcome to Airlines 101 with Laura. Today we're going to dive deep in regulations about Part 121 and fuel requirements. This is for domestic, flag, and supplemental. And I think I need to make a quick short sometime on domestic, flag, supplemental, so I will get into that. But for the meantime, you can look up the definitions of what is domestic, flag, and what is supplemental in Part 110 of 14 CFR. So got my handy book, Part 110, so check it out. We're going to go into the requirements of fuel for these different types of operations today. So first off, 121 does say that there are certain requirements that we as a dispatcher or pilot in command have to understand for figuring out how much fuel is needed. First thing is we have to consider the wind actually going on. We have to consider possible delays along the way, and we also have to allow the aircraft is going to do at least one instrument approach and a possible missed approach when it gets to the destination, plus this catch-all of anything else that might delay landing of the aircraft. So it's important that the dispatcher takes a look at this, important that PIC looks at this too, make sure that we load enough fuel considering all these specific factors. All right, now let's dive into the actual fuel numbers required. So for a domestic operation, you have to have, number one, if we're doing this under IFR, I'm not talking about VFR because there's almost very little Part 121 operations under VFR. But under IFR, we have to have enough fuel on board to fly to the airport where we are dispatched. Next, to fly to and land at the most distant alternate, if an alternate is required. And stick around, because I'm going to talk about when alternates are required and when they are not a little bit later in this video. But we have to have enough fuel to go to where we dispatched, to go to the alternate if an alternate is required, and to fly for 45 minutes after that at normal cruise fuel consumption. That's very often called the reserve fuel. Okay, so often this first to fly to the airport to which it's dispatched, often that is referred to as the burn off. So the burn off. And then you have the A for alternate fuel, and then the reserve. Okay, so that is our reserve fuel. So sometimes you will see this abbreviated as BAR, burn off alternate reserve. All right, so this is the most basic Part 121 for domestic operations. And you know what? It looks a lot like Part 91, doesn't it, for instrument flight rules? And it basically is. Okay, so let's move on to something a little more complicated. Let's look at the fuel supply. This is 121.645. Turbine engine powered airplanes other than turboprops, flag and supplemental. I'm not going to talk turboprops in this video hardly at all because primarily people are looking at this for turbojet operations. So if you look at 121.645 and you read the whole thing, it says at the end, if you are a flag operator and you're operating within the 48 contiguous United States, then you can use 121.639, which is the rule that we just looked at. So this is 121.639. We just looked at that. Okay, cool. If you are outside, it says this. So for flag operation outside the 48 contiguous United States, District of Columbia, or somebody who is going from the United States to somewhere outside, we have to, number one, have enough fuel to fly to the airport to which it was released or dispatched. Okay, so that's the burn off, like I mentioned before. Then, this is where it gets a little different, we need 10% of the total time from departure airport to destination airport. Okay, so let's say it was a 120-minute flight, then we need 12 minutes, 120 minutes, 10% of that is 12 minutes, then that is what we need, that is our extra 10%. Then we have to be able to fly to and land at the most distant alternate if an alternate's required. Again, I'm going to talk about when an alternate's required in a little bit for flag and supplemental. And then enough fuel to fly at holding speed for 30 minutes at 1,500 feet above our destination or the alternate. So alternate if alternate is required, destination if no alternate is required. Okay, so we still have burn off, all right? We still have alternate fuel. The reserve has changed, okay? We have this 30-minute holding thing, plus we have a 10% amount that's also got added. Now, some operators call that 10%, they call that contingency fuel. Some just kind of lump it in with alternate type thing, but I prefer to have it separate when we're thinking about 10%. And then some people call that 30-minute holding speed thing. Some people call that holding fuel, but frequently it's called our reserve. So it's like a 30-minute reserve plus the 10% thing, which often is called contingency fuel. Okay, so this is a little more complicated. We got our burn off, we got our contingency fuel, we have our alternate fuel, and then we have a 30-minute reserve / holding fuel. Okay, that's for flag and supplemental doing turbine-powered operations outside 48 contiguous U.S. or D.C. Now, notice also there's a little mini note that says if you are a supplemental operator with turbojets, then you're in the 48 contiguous U.S., then you should use 121.643. All right, well, we better look at that rule then, right? Because this is like a lovely rabbit trail of boop, 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 14 CFR. All right, 121.643, it's non-turbine and turboprop airplanes supplemental. Plus, like I just said, per the previous mentioned rule, we're adding turbojets operating supplemental within 48 contiguous U.S. or DC. The really main difference I've underlined here, all right, it's actually a lot like the rule for domestic, except it says no person may release instead of dispatch or take off an aircraft under IFR unless we have enough fuel to fly to the airport to which released instead of dispatched, and to fly to the most distant alternate listed on the release, and then 45 minutes. That's our reserve fuel. Okay, so this looks exactly the same. We have our burn off going to airport to which released. We have our alternate fuel, and we have reserve 45 minutes. The main difference here is that word release, because under supplemental rules, you are not required to have an aircraft dispatcher. And so they call everything release because it can be done by a flight follower who doesn't have a dispatcher certificate, and so they can't dispatch an aircraft. So, but you will see in this one, the rule is the same, okay, for domestic. All right. So now I promised we would talk about when is an alternate required. Okay, so when is an alternate required? Under domestic rules, we have this. 121.619 says that we don't need an alternate if we look at a 1 hour window before and after our estimated time of arrival at our destination airport, if weather reports, meaning weather reports or forecasts, okay, so we're talking about METARs and we're talking about TAFs or any combination of them, so those two put together show us we have an hour before to an hour after our estimated time of arrival, at least a 2,000-foot ceiling and 3 miles visibility. So if we have that, we call it the 1, 2, 3 rule. 1 for an hour before and after, 2,000-foot ceiling, and 3 miles visibility. Then we don't need an alternate airport if we are a domestic operation. So that goes back to this. If we meet that requirement, then it's kind of nice. We can remove this fuel because we don't need the alternate fuel, and we would just have a burn off and a 45-minute reserve. Okay, so that is our requirement there. That is our domestic 1, 2, 3 rule. Fairly simple. If you're used to flying IFR under Part 91, the 1, 2, 3 rule is the same thing. Okay, now let's look at flag operations. Okay, so flag requires an alternate all the time, unless we have a little get out of alternate land here. If the flight is scheduled for no more than 6 hours, and We look at 1 hour before to 1 hour after. Okay, so that's like domestic. The weather indicates, again, that's talking about weather reports and forecasts or any combination of them, METARs, TAFs. As long as an hour before to an hour after, it shows us the ceiling will be at least 1,500 feet above the circling minimum altitude, if we're going to circle, or 1,500 feet above lowest published approach minimum, or at least 2,000 feet, whichever is greater. So it's kind of a modification of the 1, 2, 3 rule. And the visibility has to be at least 3 miles or 2 miles more than the lowest visible minimum for the approach that you're going to use. So flag takes the 1, 2, 3 domestic and says, okay, it's kind of like 1, 2, 3, but we have to look at an actual approach that we're planning to use when we get there and add a little more buffer of the weather to that specific approach. Meaning if there's not a very low approach at the destination that we're going to, we are going to have an extra margin of weather, so hopefully we are able to get there, okay? But also notice if the flight is scheduled for less than 6 hours, then that is where this whole thing applies. If your flight is scheduled for more than 6 hours under flag rules, then you just plain old need an alternate, so put an alternate on there. And so then that applies to our requirement here to have an alternate airport under our fuel requirements under 121.645. Okay, so now let's move on to my supplemental rule. Okay, you're like, oh my gosh, domestic is kind of complicated, flag is even more complicated. All right, it's going to get easier. Supplemental, easy rule. Every supplemental flight always needs an alternate, period. Yay! This is like one of my favorite 14 CFRs because I used to work for a supplemental airline and we just always used an alternate. You have to have an alternate. Okay, so that's pretty simple, and that when it starts applying would be here in 121.643. This is always needing an alternate, and notice under number 2 there is no relief saying, unless one is not required. Because under supplemental an alternate always is required. What do you know about that? They did know how they were writing their rules when they wrote it. Okay, so supplemental always needs an alternate. There is one mini exception here. We got to talk about this. Unless there is no alternate available. So like Bermuda. Here's the example. There is nothing near Bermuda other than there's Bermuda. Okay. I even mapped it out. So from Norfolk, so that's pretty, Norfolk, Virginia, all the way to Bermuda, we're talking about like 630 miles. There is nothing close by to Bermuda at all. Okay, there's nothing here. So there's no other airport in Bermuda to use as an alternate. So frequently this rule is called the island alternate. This whole no available alternate, there's just not one available. So if there's no available alternate for any kind of operation, then if you don't specify an alternate, you have to, for turbojet airplanes, load 2 hours of fuel at normal cruise fuel consumption. That might not sound like a lot, but it is a lot when you think about how much would be required if we had an alternate that was close to our destination. So we have our 2 hours normal cruise fuel consumption. If you are doing a turboprop, you need 3 hours. Whew, that's a lot of fuel to carry around. So that is a lot of extra weight to be hauling around for the what's called the island alternate rule. Hope you enjoyed this little mini dive into 14 CFR regulations applicable to fuel requirements for domestic flag supplemental. Please like and subscribe and keep the suggestions for videos coming because I like making more videos so that you guys get more information. Have a good day.